A recent report submitted to Natural Resources Wales shows that 20% of properties that have long-term occupancy in a Glynneath Street bordering a landfill site have had a family member die from a rare neurodegenerative disorder in the last 5 years. This is approximately 112 times the national average. The report shows that the probable cause of these deaths is malpractice identified in the Neath-Port Talbot Council Planning Department archives that breached the 1990 Environmental Protection Act and has placed Glynneath residents in danger from identified but untreated contamination from that date. A Glynneath residents group have been battling against corruption within the Neath-Port Talbot Council planning process that has potentially cost the lives of several residents in the area. Analysts have identified many inconsistencies and deliberate acts of misconduct amongst council staff and elected councillors. Ceri Morris, the head of the planning department at Neath-Port Talbot Council, is one of the key figures in a corruption coalition that is covering up historical malpractice that would potentially cause further deaths of Glynneath residents. This video focuses on a corruption incident in the planning process for the Hale o' Glyn landfill site housing development. In it, we see how the Neath-Port Talbot Council's head of planning blatantly falsifies the role of the 1990 Environmental Protection Act within the planning process to support the corrupt actions of the planning department's Steve Ball. Background. Steve Ball, the planning department development manager, was using methods of deception and blocking tactics to avoid providing information on the contamination found at the Hale o' Glyn landfill site in 2008. We wrote to the council leader Rob Jones identifying the potential breach of the 1990 Environmental Protection Act and requested the same information. To avoid accountability for this breach of the Act, the council leader treated our information request as a complaint and passed it on to Ceri Morris, the head of the planning department. In a letter from Mr. Morris relating to his investigation of Steve Ball's deception, he deliberately falsified relevant information relating to the 1990 Act. Corruption incident. The head of planning can be seen to support Steve Ball's corrupt actions in his complaint resolution referred by the council leader. We see here a blatant falsification of both this UK government legislation and the council contaminated land policy, which allies itself with the 1990 Environmental Protection Act. In his letter dated 4th of May 2020, he says, turning specifically to the issue of land contamination at the site and whether the council has historically contravened the Environmental Protection Act 1990. I would advise that this legislation no longer applies when a site is going through the planning process. By definition, therefore, the council has not at any point contravened its duties under this legislation, as it is not relevant once the planning process has commenced. If we refer to the council's contaminated land strategy in place at the time, we will see that land contamination should be dealt with early in the planning process. One of the key objectives of the council's contaminated land strategy, key objective 4, is to ensure that during the redevelopment of new sites, land contamination issues are dealt with effectively and at an early stage of the planning process. And then we should refer to the UK Environmental Law Association's guidance on the 1990 Environmental Protection Act and contaminated land, which states, please note that the planning process does not override the contaminated land regime provided by Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act 1990. Both the Neath-Port Talbot Council Contaminated Land Strategy and an association of experts in UK environmental law state that the 1990 Act is part of the planning process. Ceri Morris states that it's not. Ceri Morris has deliberately committed an act of deception that may cost the lives of the residents he is paid to serve. If we refer to the conclusion of the report submitted to Natural Resources Wales, residents of Bryn Hyfryd are dying from the rare neurological disorder progressive supranuclear palsy. These deaths are almost certainly due to specified and other possible unspecified contamination tipped at the Hill of Glyn landfill site. Public officers who have covered up this contamination are potentially responsible for the unlawful killing of these residents. Ceri Morris is one of those public officers. In 2020, the site was tested and found to be contaminated with up to 9 times above the safety guidelines for some of the contaminants. Ceri Morris is continuing to and has potentially murdered Glynneath residents to support the corrupt activities of the Neath-Port Talbot Council Planning Department.